Congressman Larry LaRocca represented Idaho's first district for 2 terms from 1990 to 1994. I had the privilege of being his chief of staff. Larry and I, way back, perhaps almost 50 years when I think about it, as friends and colleagues who worked for Senator Frank Church. I was in Washington, D.C., and Larry represented North Idaho, based in Moscow. So his territory was everything north of the Salmon River. So he was deeply involved with the passage of the Idaho Central Wilderness Act, which became known as the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. That legislation passed in 1980. It was following the organic wilderness legislation that Frank Church also was the principal sponsor and manager of in the Senate. His other conservation measures are extensive, including the Organic Wild and Scenic Rivers Act for the entire country, and then placing a number of Idaho rivers, including parts of the Salmon and other rivers, and listing them as wild and scenic rivers under that act. He also enacted legislation such as the Sawtooth National Recreation Area to protect the Stanley Basin from development, the Hills Canyon Recreation Area, on, and I won't list them all here. Just as a matter of interest, Frank Church was dying of cancer in 1984 when the Senate, in tribute to him, voted to rename the Wilderness Act for him. And of course, now it's perhaps his best legacy is the Frank, even though many people don't realize it's named for him, or that he was essentially the key person to establish the Frank Church Wilderness. I remember Senator Howard Baker, who was the then Republican Majority Leader in the Senate, saying on the floor of the Senate what a sad day it was that they were voting on this piece of legislation to rename the wilderness for the Frank, especially its unfortunate name as the River of No Return. So that was a little gallows humor there that he mentioned on the Senate floor. But with that, let me just turn to Larry to give you a brief history of all this, and please do ask any questions, and then we'll turn to Scott for.
First of all, that the Idaho Humanities Council has assisted us in our efforts to preserve the history of this act, and I thank you for the grant that you've given to the Frank Church Institute to do the oral histories with people who were integral to the passage of the River of No Return Wilderness. Some have died, but we have a good written history of the wilderness, but we don't have the oral history. So you're helping with that, and thank you very much. I was deeply honored to serve on this staff of Senator Frank Church. It was so many years ago, but now I sort of pinch myself that I was able to spend 6 years on his staff with such a great leader, a man of high integrity and great moral bearing. And it was just, the high point of my life, except for getting elected to Congress, was to have a political mentor like Frank Church. As Gary mentioned, I served in the field for Senator Church. I was his North Idaho field representative. And essentially, I was the eyes and ears for Frank Church in 10 northern counties, and just tried to cover the territory and see what people were thinking and help them with their problems. Gary didn't mention that in '79, the Chamber of Commerce in Grangeville, Idaho, approached Senator Church and asked him to mediate the Gospel Hump wilderness controversy. the Sierra Club wanted to create a wilderness in the Gospel Hump area in Idaho County. And the Chamber of Commerce, the logging industry, was not too happy about that. And so at a meeting, they approached Senator Church. It was Louise Shattuck, who used to be the chief of staff for Orville Hanson, and she was running the North Idaho Timber Association. And she said to Church, why don't you get in the middle of this? And he said, at the moment, I will. And then on the way to the airport, he said, Larry, that's your job. Do that. I need you on the ground to do that. So I cut my teeth on wilderness legislation with the Gospel Hump Wilderness. It was very contentious, but it's a wonderful piece of landscape. And I just wanted to mention that this is the type of work that Senator Church did. He was a mediator. He understood compromise, and he passed things in a bipartisan way. The thing that's really interesting to me with this 40th anniversary, I mean, obviously, if you start doing the math with a guy like me and a guy like Gary, you know, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I was born in 1946. So, you know, we've been around a long time, and so is the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. And it's now known as the Frank. And there are people that use the Frank, revere the Frank, are happy that the Frank is there, but they don't even know how it was created or who it was named after. So it behooves all of us to really look back on the history of it and see how these things happen. The reason I think this is so important is because these are acts of Congress that happen. I think we're all familiar with the Antiquities Act, and thank you, Teddy Roosevelt, for establishing that. And many wonderful, pristine places in the United States have been protected by the Antiquities Act. And presidents use this as an executive order type of process. But creating a wilderness takes really hard work in the legislative process. There have been many attempts to establish wildernesses around the country, and not all of them have been successful. But we had, you know, we're so lucky in Idaho, 63% of the state is owned by the federal government. I think you know that statistic. And I was lucky in my congressional district, I had 5 national forests. And I mean, we're just a public land state. We're used to recreating and deriving economic benefit from those public lands. So right in the heart of Idaho, in the central Idaho area, where the Salmon River Breaks area and the Idaho Central area and the Salmon River Breaks, as I mentioned, and the conservationists had been eyeing this area for many, many years. And there were conservationists in Idaho that had walked all over the area and studied it from a landscape standpoint and a water quality standpoint. And they started drawing maps and staying in touch with Frank Church. And this was in the 70s. People like Ted Trueblood and Ernie Day and Mort Brigham, giants in the area of conservation in the state of Idaho. So they approached Church and asked him if he would work on that. And he said that he would. And what I want to say about this is that Frank Church took this job on at the end of his 4th term in the United States Senate. What impresses me about what he did at this time is that some politicians might say, you know, I'm up for re-election in 1980, and this is a pretty controversial thing. I'll just wait until I get re-elected in 1980, and then we'll take this up in 1981. But he didn't do that. He didn't do that. He forged ahead, held the hearings, and met with all of the stakeholders of this magnificent area. And let's just review that. I mean, it's 2.3 million acres of the finest wilderness in the lower 48 states. It's the largest area in the lower 48 states. Alaska has an area larger than the central Idaho wilderness, the Frank. But it's the largest in the lower 48 states. And whereas he looked to compromise where he could, the boundaries are very, very important because of the hydrologic concerns about protecting the main salmon and the tributaries of the salmon, and particularly the middle fork of the salmon. Here's a statistic for you, is that in the Frank Church River of No Return are the highest elevation spawning grounds for steelhead and salmon in the world. In the world. And we have those spawning grounds right here in Idaho. And, you know, I get pretty teary-eyed about the journey of the steelhead and the salmon back to the Frank to spawn, and the need to keep those rivers pristine and the water quality high. So that's just one attribute. The fact that people have not been in that area doesn't really bother me. It's not a national park. It's an area, of course, under the Wilderness Act, where you can't take a ATV, and you can't take chainsaws and so forth. You got to hike in. But there are areas that have access, and church protected these areas where they had landing strips. So a lot of people fly into the backcountry of the Frank, and they also use the Salmon River with jet boats to go up and down the river and then access the Frank that way. So this area is a huge laboratory for science, for climate change, for habitat, for animals and fish. There are over 100 different species of animals in the Frank. I think there are people, you're going to hear about the Taylor Ranch and other areas inside the Chamberlain Basin and so forth that are used for scientific research and so forth, an area that's untouched. And this area is going to be really critical, I think, on climate change. So Frank Church took this on. He didn't blink, and he held hearings in the state in 3 different areas. There's a great anecdote about being in Salmon, Idaho, and one person who wasn't so enamored with the creation of any wilderness in his backyard rode into the courthouse on a horse, and of course he was carrying and armed, and he rode in to sort of disrupt the hearings. And a reporter went up to Bethune Church afterwards and said, "So what'd you think of all that?" And Bethune Riley just looked at him and said, "That was really a nice horse," you know. And so she was there every step of the way, helping Frank Church create this magnificent area. I had the privilege of being on the Senate floor with Senator Church the day it passed the Senate. The senator graciously asked me to go back to Washington, D.C. and be with him for that memorable day. And it was really the high point of my political career to be there while that was happening. The debate was very interesting. Senator McClure was not a big fan of wilderness. He had strong ties to the mining industry, and he thought that Church had maybe made too sweetheart of a deal with the timber industry. But nevertheless, the bill passed on a strong bipartisan basis. There's something very important to think about with legislation like this, particularly in natural resources areas. And that is that sometimes the planets have to align for these things to pass. And I think the Church had the sense that the planets were aligned for the creation of this, and that his hard work could actually be fruitful and signed into law. So what I mean by the planet alignment is that the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate in 1980, and Jimmy Carter was president. Jimmy Carter was on his way out, so was Frank Church, as it turned out. And so the senator passed it. The House, under Chairman Seiberling, who was a strong conservationist, got the bill through the House. They worked it out, a few things, and then it was on its way to the president's desk, and Jimmy Carter signed the bill. The reason, I need to explain why I think this is important. It's because Steve Sims, who defeated Frank Church in 1980, did not believe in the concept of wilderness. if he had his way, he would roll back wilderness because he thought it was an overreach by the federal government, that it was too constraining on the timber and mining industry. And he just simply did not believe in the Wilderness Act. And I have a good friend that I served with in Congress, Pat Williams, who passed a few wilderness bills subsequent to 1980. He got them through the House, he got them through the Senate, and there were compromises made along the way, and Ronald Reagan vetoed those bills, and they've never seen the light of day since. So the planet alignment for this to pass was remarkably intact in 1980. But without the courage of Senator Church doing this at that time, we would not have this magnificent wilderness that we celebrate this year. Keep in mind that he lost by 3,000 votes. And we could all sit around as historians or concerned individuals and people who are well informed and say, was it the wilderness? Was it his position on the Panama Canal treaties? Was it the fact that he was in there too long? Was it a wave election? But I would offer to you that by stepping up and creating this wilderness, it contributed in some way to his defeat, but he marched on anyway to do this in a great act of political courage. He used the boundaries that the conservationists believed in. The compromises that he made for the aircraft and the private planes landing on the airstrips, which were already in the middle of the wilderness, and the jet boats, did not impact necessarily on the integrity of the watershed, which is most important here when you're talking about the salmon and steelhead and the water quality. And the Frank is a fish factory, and that's what it is if you just sort of think of it that way. So he saw that vision, he saw the science, and he went with it, and then he got the job done by being tenacious. We've seen other wilderness efforts in the state of Idaho. For example, the Owyhee Canyon lands. That was more of a bottom-up kind of a process where everybody at the local level just decided to get together and hammer out an agreement. Senator Crapo told the stakeholders on the local level that if they came up with a proposal, he would introduce it into the legislative process in the Senate. It was a different process. It doesn't mean that it was less courageous, but we saw over the years that there have been different ways to approach wilderness legislation. It was much the same way with the Boulder White Clouds that Congressman Simpson championed, and he worked with people at the local level. It took many years to hammer that out, and finally they got a deal and did it in a bipartisan way. At the Frank Church Institute, our theme for the next 5 years is how democracy survive and thrive in the 21st century. The way I like to talk about this legislation is that it was the epitome of the democratic process. It was conceived by a member of Congress who championed it, who worked hard and rolled up his sleeves and dealt with the stakeholders, held hearings, and got it through. And that's the essence of democracy. And I think it's a good lesson for us in these times when some of the safeguards and the guardrails and the norms of democracy are being eroded and attacked in various ways, is that we should remember that that's the way it was done. I think that Senator McClure was extremely magnanimous by naming, pushing the legislation to name it after Senator Church. Just as a personal aside, and I think Gary will back me up on this, is that I don't think Frank Church wanted a post office named after him. I think the greatest tribute to Senator Church on this was to name this magnificent wilderness after him. So I am impressed. You know, we sort of march on in time, and people have short memories about how things are done. So the reason that we chose to celebrate the Frank and the 40th year is that we really wanted to talk to people about how the legislative process works, and how these things don't happen without a champion and without somebody rolling up their sleeves and working hard at it. I think it's important for Idahoans and American citizens to realize how these things come about. I was honored to have the Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Area be celebrated for its 25th anniversary, and that was my legislation that I passed. And I think the reason I worked so hard on that is because my mentor, Frank Church, showed me the way. And until the Canyon lands and until the Boulder White Clouds, that legislation passed in 1993 was the only piece of public lands legislation that we've had in Idaho. So the boundaries are important. If you look at the legislation, you will see, and read it, you'll see many things that are recognized in terms of timber and the way it's going to be managed. But basically, a wilderness bill has an accompanying set of maps, and those are submitted to the Forest Service, and they're part of the legislative history. And it's a map with a Sharpie pen, sort of identifying where those boundaries are. And when you look at the Middle Fork being protected, and the Salmon River and all of its tributaries, that is really a crown jewel for us in Idaho. So the courage of Frank Church, I think, is part of our message with the celebration of this, the history of how wilderness is created. Gary mentioned that Frank Church was instrumental in the passage of the Organic Act, of the Wilderness Act. And with that came an instant wilderness, which was the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. And what had not been done is to include the River of No Return Wilderness, which is very close, except for a very narrow corridor. The two are almost linked up, but it still stands as the largest wilderness in the lower 48 states.
Let me ask Trent if this all sounds familiar to you as someone who's very familiar with legislation.
Well, yes, it does. And of course, I was not working as a staffer at the time of passage of the Central Idaho Wilderness, but everything that Congressman LaRocca just detailed is accurate to my knowledge. I did have one question though for the congressman, and that is, I'm familiar with, and by the way, you described Steve Sims's attitude about the Wilderness Act of 1964 exactly right. The other person representing Idaho at the time was George Hansen, and I don't remember his rhetoric, but my guess would be he wasn't a fan of the Central Idaho Wilderness Bill either. So who carried the bill in the House? Was it Congressman Seiberling, or who did it in the House?
Actually, Sims was in the House of Representatives at the time, Trent, and so that was 1980. So it was George Hansen was in the House then. And quite frankly, the power of the chairman of the House committee just sort of took the bill and said, there's an Idahoan who is championing this, and we're going to roll with it. And in a sense, Sims got rolled on it because at that point, he had been in the House he was in his 5th term, because he wasn't. It wasn't his fifth term. He was elected in '74, I think. So it was third or fourth term, and he was just sort of a pain to the Natural Resources Committee and on anything that had to do with preservation, conservation, or protection. And so Cyberling just sort of ran over him and took the bill and rammed it through. And and the same was true with George Hansen. But Sims' position was virulently opposed to it. As a matter of fact, during the Gospel Hump Wilderness, there was a huge meeting at the Elks Hall in Grangeville about the compromise that was developed by Church and the Sierra Club and the Chamber. And the wrecking crew that came in to disturb the whole meeting was Sims's aide, Bob Smith, who ended up who had run against Church in '74. And so they were very disruptive about it. And, we live in a world today, this is pre-social media, but we live in a world of conspiracy theories and sort of exaggerated claims and so forth. The opposition, namely Sims and others, were revving up folks in the timber-dependent communities that their jobs were at stake if this wilderness passed. And that didn't come to fruition. And sure, there's a lot of timber there, but it's inaccessible timber as well. Keep in mind that this was a roadless area. And the beauty of what we had in Idaho was that we had so many areas that were unroaded and were essentially de facto wilderness. So as we know with logging is that unless you're doing some selective helicopter logging and so forth, that you're building roads, which is on the Idaho batholith soils is very damaging to fish and aquatic life and water quality. So they were not fans at all. And the mining industry was really opposed to this. Church did do a compromise on a cobalt mine up near Salmon. They set up a special use for mining cobalt up there. And Jim McClure made a big deal out of cobalt and its strategic value to the United States for defense purposes. It was a major part of the debate, actually, was cobalt. And interestingly, the mine has never been an economic success. But Church did agree to that. The environmentalists weren't too happy about it, actually, but the rest of the bill was pretty much intact in terms of the protection of the watershed.
I just have a quick question. Can our current president remove the designation?
No, it is not an executive order. The only way that it can be removed is if, the current president, he could sign a bill that would be introduced in the Congress, pass the Congress, make it to his desk. There was an incident where Steve Sims, when he was in the Senate, tried to roll back part of the Hell's Canyon wilderness area, tried to make a boundary change with one of those maps that I talked about. So he made a run at it, but he was not successful. But it would have to be done by an act of Congress. An act of Congress created it, and an amendment to that act based on maps and other things. There would have to be hearings and so forth. But we say that these areas are protected in perpetuity in a sense. But you raise a good point because with the wrong planet alignment, things can be reversed. But I think you're thinking too of the Antiquities Act set-asides that Obama did, and that the Utah congressional delegation insisted that Trump roll back. But those were not protected by legislation. It was under executive order under the Antiquities Act.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Larry? Oh, yes, I see Rocky waving his hand.
Congressman LaRocca, thank you for joining us today. I was just curious, do you have any additional insights into how the boundaries were drawn? You talked about the Forest Service having a Sharpie marker and literally kind of drawing on a map. And in those concessions, did it become smaller or bigger than you originally anticipated from the outset? And then
the conservationists have given Church an A+, gold, 5 gold stars, and as many accolades as you can imagine in the way that the boundaries were drawn. That he did not shirk away from trying to make it smaller. I must say that he actually enlarged it by taking in certain areas that were close to the Magruder corridor. In the end, that actually pushed it over 2 million acres. You can imagine sort of the machinations that politicians go through, and they say, if it's under 2 million acres, people won't think it's very big. You know, if we go over 2 million acres, it sounds like it's a land grab by the feds, you know, that kind of thing. But Frank Church did not shirk away from that, and the boundaries were drawn very scientifically and very precisely to protect the watershed. There was no marginalization or any attempt to cut back or to save a particular area, you know, for logging or anything. There was an area in Idaho County in the Nez Perce National Forest called Meadow Creek. It became very, very controversial because the people in Elk City thought that the timber in Meadow Creek was critical to their livelihoods there, and a timber-dependent community. And Church did not include that in the wilderness, which did not have any effect on the overall integrity of the water. But the conservationists coveted that area, and there was what we call release language in the bill that released certain areas to be studied by the Forest Service for possible timber management, let's say. And Meadow Creek was one of them, and it's a magnificent area. It's never been logged up to this point, 40 years later. And I actually included that area in a wilderness proposal I had, which angered a lot of people in that region. So.
Okay.